time rescuers reached them, Andrew's body was wedged in the crawlway like a broken doll, and Attila was screaming, half-conscious, soaked to the bone, and clawing at the rock like it was alive. Real Well Cave had swallowed them whole for over 24 hours, dragging them through a nightmare of flooding tunnels, plummeting temperatures, and failing gear. What began as a simple weekend crawl became a slow-motion death trap. This wasn't just a caving accident. It was a perfect storm of human error, hypothermia, and psychological unraveling, and it left one man dead, another shattered, and rescuers haunted by what they found in the dark. What was supposed to be a routine caving expedition, a thrilling but manageable descent into Tennessee's most notorious vertical cave, became a nightmare that would test the very limits of human endurance and reveal how quickly confidence can transform into catastrophe when the earth itself becomes your enemy. March 18, 1997. The morning sky wept with the persistence of a mourner, gray clouds unleashing a steady drizzle that turned the Tennessee landscape into a watercolor painting of despair. But inside the cramped interior of a mud-splattered pickup truck winding through the backwoods toward Real Well Cave, excitement crackled like electricity between two men who had no idea they were driving toward their own personal apocalypse. Andrew Mitchell, 32 years old and carrying the weathered confidence of someone who had descended into the earth's bowels more times than he could count, gripped the steering wheel with hands that had felt the bite of countless ropes and the scrape of limestone against flesh. His eyes held the gleam of addiction, not to drugs or alcohol, but to something far more dangerous, the intoxicating rush of conquering the unconquerable, of descending into places where humans were never meant to tread. Beside him sat Attila Carruth, 26, and vibrating with the kind of nervous energy that comes from being just experienced enough to be dangerous to yourself. 5 caves. That was the extent of his underground resume, 5 brief encounters with the subterranean world that had left him hungry for more. He had no way of knowing that experience without wisdom is often more lethal than ignorance itself, because ignorance at least breeds caution. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless precipitation as they approached their destination, the rhythmic scraping creating a funeral march soundtrack to their journey. Through the rain-streaked glass, the landscape looked ominous, twisted trees reaching toward the gray sky like skeletal fingers, their branches heavy with moisture that dripped steadily onto the saturated earth below. Real Well Cave's reputation preceded it like the shadow of a predator. 160 feet of sheer vertical drop greeted anyone brave or foolish enough to attempt its entrance, a limestone throat that swallowed explorers whole and spat them back out fundamentally changed, if it spat them back out at all. The cave had claimed its share of victims over the years, men and women who had underestimated its power and paid the ultimate price for their hubris. But on this rain-soaked morning, Andrew and Attila felt invincible. They had planned this expedition for weeks, studying maps and discussing techniques with the obsessive attention to detail that serious cavers brought to their craft. They had checked and double-checked their equipment, calculated the time needed for their descent and exploration, and convinced themselves that they were prepared for whatever the cave might throw at them. As they pulled up to the muddy parking area near the cave entrance, the sound hit them immediately, a thunderous roar that seemed to emerge from the very heart of the earth itself. The waterfall that normally trickled down the entrance shaft had been transformed by the morning's rain into a raging torrent, a liquid avalanche that crashed into the depths with the fury of a natural disaster. Andrew killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, listening to the ominous rumble that filtered up from below. The sound was different from what he remembered from previous visits, more violent and unpredictable. It spoke of danger in a language that experienced cavers learned to understand, but on this day, that voice of caution was drowned out by anticipation and pride. Attila stepped out of the truck first, his boots squelching in the mud as he walked toward the cave entrance. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of wet earth, and even above ground, he could feel the temperature drop as they approached the gaping maw in the limestone. The entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, darkness so complete it seemed to possess physical weight. They moved with practiced efficiency, unloading their gear and spreading it out on a relatively dry patch of ground. Ropes coiled like sleeping serpents, harnesses hung ready for duty, and metal hardware glinted dully in the gray morning light. But conspicuously absent from their equipment array were the wet suits that remained folded in the back of the truck. The decision to leave those suits behind seemed logical at the time. The air temperature wasn't particularly cold, and the cave's constant 72 degrees would provide relief from the damp chill of the surface. Besides, they reasoned, a little water never hurt anyone. It was a decision that would echo through the hours to come like a death sentence, each drop of water that touched their skin stealing another fraction of their body heat until hypothermia became not just a possibility but an inevitability. Attila's gear setup was a masterpiece of improvisation that would have made experienced cavers wince in horror. His climbing system, if it could be called that, was a Frankenstein's monster of incompatible components held together by hope and determination rather than engineering and common sense. A commercial seat harness connected to a hand-tied chest harness through a daisy chain of 6 non-locking carabiners, each one a potential point of failure that multiplied the danger exponentially. The cow's tail sling that connected his descender to his harness was far too long, a seemingly minor detail that would soon spell disaster in the most literal sense. His Petzl shunt, designed to serve as a backup safety device, was attached to a foot sling that created more problems than it solved. But perhaps most dangerous of all was his attitude, the cocky confidence of someone who had survived 5 caves and now believed himself invincible. Andrew noticed the haphazard nature of his friend's setup and felt a flicker of concern dance across his consciousness. The rational part of his brain whispered warnings about equipment compatibility and safety protocols, but the primal excitement of the impending descent shouted those whispers into silence. There would be time to address any problems once they were underground, he told himself. There was always time. The roar of the waterfall grew louder as they approached the entrance, a sound that seemed to emerge from the very core of the earth. What had been a manageable trickle during their planning visits had been transformed by the morning's rain into a liquid hammer that pounded the limestone with relentless fury. The water cascaded down the entrance shaft with such violence that it created its own weather system, filling the air with mist that made visibility poor and footing treacherous. Andrew rigged his rappel device first, his experienced hands moving through the familiar motions with muscle memory born of countless descents. The rope felt solid and reassuring in his grip, a lifeline that connected him to the surface world above. But as he positioned himself at the edge of the entrance shaft and looked down into the abyss, a chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold air. The waterfall was directly in their path. There was no avoiding it, no alternative route that would keep them dried during the descent. They would have to rappel directly through the torrent, allowing hundreds of gallons of near-freezing water to batter their bodies as they descended into the earth's embrace. It was possible, but it was also dangerous in ways that went far beyond simple discomfort. But they had come too far to turn back now. The adrenaline was flowing, the excitement was building, and the cave was calling to them with a siren song that drowned out all rational thought. Andrew stepped off the edge and began his descent into hell. The first impact of the water was like being struck by a frozen fist. The torrent hit him with stunning force, soaking through his clothes in seconds and sending shock waves of cold through his body that made his muscles contract involuntarily. The water was everywhere, in his eyes, his nose, his mouth, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to see clearly. Each foot of descent brought fresh agony as the waterfall pounded him relentlessly. His rope became slick and treacherous, the metal hardware of his rappel device growing cold enough to burn his skin through his gloves. The familiar motions of rappelling became a desperate struggle for control as the water tried to tear him from the rope and send him plummeting into the darkness below. By the time Andrew reached the bottom of the entrance shaft 160 feet below the surface, his body was already beginning the inexorable slide toward hypothermia. His clothes clung to him like a second skin made of ice, and his core temperature had dropped several degrees from its normal baseline. But the worst was yet to come. Attila followed his friend into the abyss, and the waterfall seemed to greet him with even greater fury. Perhaps it was because the rain had intensified during Andrew's descent, or perhaps it was simply that the cave sensed fresh prey. Whatever the reason, the torrent that hammered Attila during his rappel was a liquid avalanche that transformed his descent into a battle for survival before he even reached the bottom. The water struck him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending spasms of shock through his nervous system. His improvised gear setup, already questionable under ideal conditions, became actively dangerous when subjected to the violence of the waterfall. The long cow's tail that connected his descender to his harness whipped around his body like a snake, threatening to tangle in his equipment or wrap around his throat. But somehow, miraculously, Attila completed his descent and found himself standing beside Andrew in the first chamber of Real Well Cave. The sound of the waterfall was muffled here, filtered through 160 feet of stone and distance, but its presence still dominated the acoustic landscape like the breathing of some enormous beast. The cave stretched away from them into darkness so complete it seemed to have texture and weight. Their headlamps carved thin cones of light through the blackness, revealing glimpses of limestone formations that had been carved by water over millions of years. Flowstone cascaded down the walls like frozen waterfalls, and delicate soda straws hung from the ceiling like nature's own chandelier. Under normal circumstances, the beauty would have taken their breath away. But these were not normal circumstances. Both men were already soaked to the bone, their body temperatures dropping with each passing second as the cave's constant 72-degree temperature, pleasant under normal conditions, began to feel like the inside of a refrigerator against their wet skin. They pressed deeper into the cave system, following passages that twisted and turned through the limestone like the corridors of some vast underground palace. The formations grew more spectacular with each chamber they entered, testament to the patient artistry of geological time. But neither man was in any condition to appreciate the cave's natural splendor. Attila was the first to voice what they were both feeling. His teeth had begun to chatter uncontrollably, a rhythmic clicking that echoed off the stone walls like castanets. His whole body was trembling with the effort of maintaining its core temperature, and his coordination was beginning to suffer as his nervous system diverted resources from fine motor control to the more pressing need of staying warm. "Andrew," he said, his voice shaking with more than just cold, "I can't stay down here. I think I need to get out." The words hung in the air between them like a confession of weakness, but Andrew understood immediately that his friend was in serious trouble. The signs of hypothermia were unmistakable, the uncontrollable shivering, the pale skin, the difficulty speaking clearly. They had been underground for less than an hour, but the combination of wet clothes and cool air had already begun the process that would either end in rescue or death. "All right," Andrew replied, trying to keep his own voice steady despite the growing alarm he felt. "I'll get the ropes ready." But even as he spoke the words, Andrew knew that their situation had moved beyond difficult into truly dangerous territory. The waterfall that had battered them during their descent was still raging above them, still pounding down with relentless fury. Any attempt to ascend would require them to climb directly through that torrent, and Attila was already showing signs that his body was beginning to shut down. Attila began rigging his ascent system with hands that shook violently from the cold. His improvised gear setup, questionable under the best of circumstances, became actively lethal when assembled by someone whose fine motor control was compromised by hypothermia. The chain of 6 non-locking carabiners that connected his ascender to his harness was a disaster waiting to happen, and the waiting was almost over. The ascent began as a battle against physics, human endurance, and the implacable hostility of moving water. Attila clipped his gear to the rope and began the agonizing process of ascending hand over hand while the waterfall did its best to tear him loose and send him plummeting back to the cave floor. Each handhold was agony. The rope was slick with water and cold enough to burn his skin through his gloves. His ascenders, designed to grip the rope securely, became treacherous as ice began to form on the metal surfaces. The waterfall battered him without mercy, each gallon of water that struck his body stealing more precious body heat and driving him closer to the edge of unconsciousness. But the real catastrophe was still building. Halfway up the entrance shaft, disaster struck with the inevitability of gravity itself. One of the non-locking carabiners in Attila's improvised gear system finally succumbed to the stress and vibration of his ascent. The gate opened, the carabiner slipped free, and suddenly Attila found himself hanging from his cow's tail alone, that same cow's tail that was far too long and had stretched under his weight until his ascender was completely out of reach. He was trapped. suspended in the middle of the waterfall, unable to go up or down, while hypothermia slowly drained the life from his body 1 degree at a time. His voice, when he tried to call for help, was lost in the thunderous roar of the water. The sound of his desperate shouts was swallowed by the acoustic chaos of the cave, leaving him as isolated as if he were floating in the vacuum of space. Andrew, waiting at the bottom of the shaft, gradually became aware that something had gone terribly wrong. The sounds from above had changed, less movement, more distress. When he finally heard Attila's voice cutting through the waterfall's roar, the words chilled him more than the cave air ever could. "I can't, Andrew. I can't." Those words triggered something primal in Andrew's brain, an override system that pushed aside fear and exhaustion in favor of action. Without hesitation, he clipped into the rope and began his own ascent, racing against time and hypothermia to reach his friend before it was too late. The climb was a nightmare of physical agony and mechanical precision. Each placement of his ascenders was deliberate and careful, because a single mistake would send both men to their deaths. The waterfall hammered him just as it had hammered Attila, but Andrew had the advantage of being slightly less hypothermic and considerably more experienced. He climbed with the grim determination of someone who understood that failure meant watching his friend die. When Andrew finally reached Attila's position, the sight that greeted him was worse than his darkest fears. His friend was hanging limp in his harness, conscious but barely responsive. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia, and his eyes held the glassy stare of someone whose body was beginning the process of shutting down non-essential systems to preserve core functions. The rescue attempt that followed would have challenged an expert under ideal conditions. Attempting it while suspended in a waterfall, with both rescuer and victim suffering from hypothermia, made it virtually impossible. Andrew knew the theory: attach the victim to your own harness and descend together in a controlled fall. But theory and practice were separated by a chasm as wide as the entrance shaft itself. His numbed fingers fumbled with carabiners and slings while the waterfall did its best to tear him from the rope. Each attempt to connect Attila to his own gear was thwarted by the relentless assault of water and the progressive deterioration of his fine motor skills. The cold was creeping into his own body now, stealing warmth and coordination with each passing second. After several failed attempts, Andrew tried a different approach. If he couldn't perform a traditional pick-off rescue, perhaps he could climb out while tethered to Attila, dragging his friend to safety through brute force and determination. He connected a sling between their harnesses and began to ascend, carrying not just his own weight but Attila's as well. For 15 feet, it seemed like the plan might work. Andrew's muscles screamed with the effort, but he was making progress upward. Attila hung below him like dead weight, occasionally stirring but unable to contribute to their ascent. The waterfall continued its assault, but Andrew climbed with the desperate strength that sometimes emerges when death becomes the only alternative to success. But 15 feet was all his body could manage. The combination of hypothermia, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of two men proved too much for even his experienced strength to overcome. His muscles simply gave out, cramping and seizing as his body reached the absolute limits of its endurance. Now both men hung in the waterfall, both trapped by their own ambition and the cave's implacable hostility. Time was running out with each degree their body temperatures dropped, and Andrew knew that he had perhaps minutes before he joined Attila in the grip of severe hypothermia. In a final desperate act of self-preservation, Andrew managed to swing himself toward a narrow ledge that jutted out from the cave wall. It was barely wide enough to support a human body, slick with moisture and treacherous, but it represented the only solid ground within reach. With his last reserves of strength, he hauled himself onto the ledge and collapsed, his body convulsing with hypothermic shivers that threatened to shake him off his precarious perch. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the thunder of the waterfall and the much quieter sound of his own breathing. Attila hung motionless in the torrent below, and Andrew knew with crystalline clarity that his friend was dying. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow, but his own body was too damaged by cold and exhaustion to mount any further rescue attempts. Consciousness came and went in waves. Andrew would find himself aware and alert for a few minutes, then slip into a hypothermic stupor that might have been sleep or might have been something much more dangerous. Time became elastic and unreliable, measured not in minutes or hours but in the gradual progression from shivering to numbness to the peculiar warmth that signals the final stages of hypothermia. When Andrew finally awakened with enough clarity to assess his situation, the silence told him everything he needed to know. The waterfall still roared with undiminished fury, but from below came no sounds of movement or distress. Attila hung motionless in his harness, and even from his position on the ledge, Andrew could see that his friend's struggle was over. The ascent that followed was the loneliest climb of Andrew's life. His gear worked properly, his technique was sound, but each foot of progress upward carried him further from his friend and deeper into a grief that would follow him for the rest of his days. The waterfall continued to batter him, but its power to cause harm seemed diminished now that the worst had already happened. When Andrew finally emerged from Real Well Cave, collapsing onto the muddy ground near the entrance, the gray sky above looked like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He lay there gasping in the cool air, his body racked with shivers that were part hypothermia and part emotional shock, and called for help with a voice that cracked like breaking stone. The rescue teams that arrived hours later found Attila's body still suspended in the waterfall, a victim of equipment failure, inexperience, and the cave's ruthless indifference to human ambition. The doctor who examined him confirmed what Andrew already knew: hypothermia had claimed another life, stealing warmth and hope with the methodical patience of falling water. The investigation that followed would dissect every decision, every piece of equipment, every moment of the tragedy with the cold precision of hindsight. The wet suits that remained in the truck. The improvised gear that failed at the worst possible moment. The waterfall that should have been an absolute barrier rather than a challenge to be overcome. But no investigation could capture the essential truth of what happened in Real Well Cave that day. Two friends had descended into the earth carrying confidence and enthusiasm, and only one had returned. The cave had claimed its tribute, as caves had been doing since humans first learned to descend into darkness, and would continue doing long after the last caver had hung up his gear and accepted that some places on Earth are not meant for human exploration. In the end, Andrew's survival and Attila's death came down to a handful of critical factors that aligned with mathematical precision to create tragedy. A few degrees of temperature difference. A few seconds of better decision-making. A few pieces of properly configured equipment. The margin between life and death in the underground world is measured in such tiny increments that the difference can seem almost random, but the consequences are always absolute. Real Well Cave still receives visitors, cavers who descend its entrance shaft with the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that Andrew and Attila felt on that rain-soaked morning in March. Most emerge safely, carrying stories of underground beauty and personal triumph. But the cave remembers those who don't, adding their names to a roster that stretches back through decades of human ambition meeting geological indifference. The waterfall still falls, as it has for millions of years and will for millions more. It remembers nothing and judges no one, continuing its patient work of carving stone and claiming lives with the same implacable consistency. For in the end, water always wins, not through malice or design, but through the simple physics of persistence and the immutable law that in the underground world, every mistake has consequences, and some consequences cannot be survived.